Fáilte a chuirde chuige Blúiríní Béaloidis, podcast de chuid cnúsach féidir éireann se gláiste Holscoile i Blach Lia. You're very welcome to Folklore Fragments, the podcast in the National Folklore Collection here in University College Dublin. I'm Jonny Dillon.
I'm still Claire Doohan.
Good. And we shall be your obliging hosts over the next hour, so stay with us as we traverse and explore some of the stranger aspects of our folk tradition and cultural heritage. Now, the subject of today's podcast, if you can guess, dear listeners, orbits the Earth in a prograde direction. It influences the rising and falling of our oceanic tides. It is floating almost 240,000 miles from Earth. It's plainly visible in the night sky and is approximately 4.6 billion years old. That's right, you might have guessed correctly. Today we're talking about Marxism.
Yes.
We're not. I jest, we will avoid all considerations of dialectical materialism, thank God, in this episode, focusing our attentions instead on traditions regarding another lifeless body of higher now, namely our own moon. I feel kind of bad for referring to the moon as a lifeless body.
It is a bit harsh.
It is slightly harsh.
But it'll tie in with what we're talking about.
It will, in a sense, actually, yeah.
Habitation of the moon and
what. It shall. Now, in the course of our explorations today, we shall consider the moon and its various reputed inhabitants, from thieves to doomed spirits to a pair of kidnapped children from Norse mythology, and we'll further consider the moon and its maddening effects on the behaviour of humans, and consider the writings of an eccentric 19th century reverend who was so intrigued by the moon that he spoke of it as having created more merriment, more marvel, and more mystery than all of the other orbs taken together.
Is this Reverend Harley?
This is the good Reverend Harley.
My new favourite. His
fondness for cosmic orbs. So, do you want to set out some of the order of the
agenda?
The agenda, as it were.
Perfect. Hello, folks. So what we'll start off with is the idea of the moon in antiquity and the days of the week and the role it would have played in the lives of those who came before us. Then we'll jump into the folk custom in general and how it's important to frame these ideas in a broader sense, because it's very easy to dismiss them in kind of our modern environment where we're kind of marching towards progress always and forgetting these older methods.
So we think. So we would like to think.
Exactly, but we're here to prove them wrong, Jonny.
Exactly.
So it's important to understand this in a broader context, in a broader European context, an international context, and historical context, to see the role it played in the past and what role, if any, it plays today. Then we'll look at the moon and impact on human affairs, which is a huge one. We've gone down the rabbit hole here, Jonny, totally. Haven't we?
We've lost the plot,
For the last month we've been, ask us anything about the moon. It's going to be our new pub quiz topic of choice. So we're going to do moon and the impact on human affairs, where we look at what's thought lucky about the phases of the moon, how it guides the decisions people make in the course of their working lives, kind of on the farm, planting, weeding, butchery, dealing with livestock, luck, health, birth, death, etc. Then we'll move on to the moon as a place of habitation, which is hugely interesting, and how our ancestors and those in antiquity would have looked at it. And then we'll finish up with a treat from the archive, as we always do.
Actually, and it's worth mentioning as well that this topic has been chosen because on the day of our releasing this particular episode, there happens to be a supermoon, which is also a new moon. Particularly auspicious time to begin new endeavours, as we shall see.
It's true.
Some of the material that we'll be looking at, it's worth kind of considering, I suppose, this body of folk tradition that exists, to consider it as something that's kind of essential to human experience or to our ancestors, to our forebears. But often the thinking that goes into it is quite kind of disprivileged, say, in a modern context, or it's viewed as kind of, in public discourse at least, as being kind of bygone relic or some inferior age, something that's kind of cast off as humanity marches ever onward towards this kind of, as you were mentioning, this kind of notion of a mythic, let's say, idea of progress, basically. But I suppose the beliefs and the folk customs that we're looking at, they're analogous to the scientific method. This is what the late great Jonny said, and that these things kind of aim to examine the forces in the natural world that impact upon human affairs. So they look at the natural world and they look at the heavens, and they look at these kind of with a certain kind of dramatic or imaginative aspect to them, basically. But this is kind of done with reference to emotional reasoning or emotion and symbolism, or ideas of essence or opposites or likeness, or a general kind of dramatic and imaginative interpretation of the world around us. So the beliefs and customs that we'll set out here and we'll display before you in this episode are part of a kind of system of reasoning, but one which isn't based purely on kind of cold logic and rationale, but it's based on symbolism or some sort of ideas of the transcendent and the other world and this sort of stuff. And folk custom, basically, I suppose, it should be considered as a thing for people to kind of bring away from this, at least, that it's something that's essential to human affairs, or it's viewed as being kind of essentially important in protecting humans in a certain way. But it tries to answer the meaning of being. It tries to answer the why of being as opposed to the what of being, in a sense. It looks for meaning in the natural world around us, as opposed to maybe just the scientific method, which just describes material processes. Whereas this material and folk custom and folk tradition in this sense tries to answer the why, the kind of meaning behind it.
Which makes sense to me in what we've been reading as well, because if you're thinking of these, whether it's kind of going back into antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, they're living in a world where the world is unexplored. We know what the map of the world looks like now. We know what's in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere. We know what's beyond the horizon. But we're thinking about a time when we were beginning this discussion of when there was a great deal of the unknown. And so it makes sense that they had to use what resources they had there available to them.
Yeah.
So now, of course, the Greeks and the Romans were hugely advanced in their thinking, but for those more primitive tribes, for example, it's going to make sense that they're going to use the landscape, that they're going to use what they see in the sky to try and make some sense of the measurement of time, the passing of their lives.
Yeah.
So it ties in.
It's one of the, I mean, even if you consider, I suppose, the idea of the measurement of time by observing the heavens, obviously, which is something that's still done kind of today with great detail and depth and precision and so on. But that is a particularly old kind of idea. Even look at the likes of Newgrange or various kind of stone circles and so on that respond to the solstices and so on and so forth. But the idea of the measurement of time by viewing the moon, kind of breaking into these different phases, is particularly old, and we can see it even like as part again. We're talking about going down the rabbit hole with this podcast. As at the start of trying to kind of gather material from the archive here relating to the moon and folk tradition, one thing begins to lead to another, and all of a sudden I was kind of looking at the names and origins of days in the week, which is a strange even thing to consider, but I often wouldn't think, but that the heavens feature quite heavily in our naming of the days of the week, basically.
Okay.
So, say even, I suppose, when we consider the splitting up of the week into a 7-day period was something that the ancient Romans did. And they named each day of the week after one of what were called the sacred 7 luminaries, or the 7 naked eye planets. And they use the word planets in the sense of kind of wanderers, so not strictly speaking planets. But these are the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so each day of the week was in turn was named after one of the 7 heavenly bodies which was seen to rule over it. So each particular day had a particular planet associated with it. So Sunday obviously is associated with the sun. Moon Day is associated with the moon. Then we have like similarly in Irish, Dillon.
Oh, Dillon.
Tuesday is for Mars, and that was later dedicated to Tyr, who was a Germanic pagan, a god of law and glory. This is kind of what becomes known as interpretatio Germanica, where the Germans and the German tribes readapt the Roman naming of days after gods that represent heavenly bodies, but they call them by their own gods.
Okay.
So we have in Irish, for example, De Mort, after Mars. Still, you can see that kind of reference. But in kind of the Germanic system, I suppose, it's dedicated to the god Tyr, and then in English now we have that reflects itself as Tuesday. So you see that kind of connection through again. For the Romans, then Wednesday was named after Mercury, so we have Mercredi in French. Then Thursday was dedicated to Jupiter or to Zeus, and then that later on was turned to Thor's Day, again by our friends in the Germanic tribes. Then the 5th day of the week, the Roman conception was ascribed to Venus, and this in Europe became associated with the goddess Freya, and so that becomes then Friday. And then Saturday is Saturn, and then we're back to Sunday. Then in Irish, so you can see that we have Didonig is Sunday, from Dia Dominica, or the Lord's Day. So you see aspects of kind of Christian tradition coming into it as well. Then De Lune, like I mentioned, after the moon, Luna. De Mort is for Mars. And then we have strange things as well that show the Christian tradition or Christianization and certain kind of church practices and how they manifest in the names of days of the week. So we have Decading, Wednesday in Irish means first fast, and Dehina means day of fasting, and Deirdín, or Thursday, means day between two fasts, or day idir cha'in, so Deirdín. So the measurement of time through observance of the heavens is of considerable antiquity, as is the notion then that time corresponds to certain meanings. So this even something you'd see in the Zodiac, that certain months are ruled over by certain tendencies, that certain days are ruled over by certain deities with certain tendencies. But it shows as well, this is something we were saying yesterday, it shows all you need to do is recite the names of the days in the week in a few different languages, in Irish, in English, in French, in German, whatever. And straight away you will be shown thousands of years of religious tradition, pagan and Christian, straight away, in no time flat. That also references the heavens, gods that they represented, how they were later reinterpreted by Germanic tribes. I mean, you could say to someone, "Oh, what do you know of the German god of glory, tears?" Nothing. But yet, one of our days of the week is essentially named after him.
You start digging into it.
Exactly, yeah. As is Friday after Freya, or Thursday, and so on and so forth.
This really is the pub quiz podcast.
We're going to win every pub quiz from now on, yeah.
Our fortunes are made, Jonny.
But yeah, this idea of the measurement of time and the measurement of time through an observance of the heavens is of great antiquity, and not just kind of, again, in a materialist sense where you're just coldly observing things as they pass, but also imbuing those periods with a certain meaning.
Yeah.
And so we have obviously then Sunday, and then we're concerned with Moon Day, with Monday, with Dillon, with Luna, and the effects of that heavenly body on human affairs in many ways. And many of the considerations that we'll move to look at now often focus on what happens on Earth here when the moon is waxing, what happens when it's waning. And this idea of, again, to go back to folk custom and the reasoning behind it, the idea that I suppose the effects of the natural world, or when the natural world is kind of expressing itself in a certain way, that will have an impact on human affairs that are seemingly unrelated, but the idea is that these things are kind of connected. But we'll look at it in greater detail.
Yeah, it'll become clear as we go through examples, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think, as you were saying, we're so unfamiliar with having to have this knowledge now, because I don't know about you, but I don't, have a farm of crops that I'm caring for each day, so I don't need to know about the phases of the moon necessarily in my day-to-day life. So to me, some of this was really interesting, even though coming from kind of a rural background, we just don't need to know this in our daily lives. So it will become clear as we go through examples what it is that we mean when we say it's a good time for planting in the dark of the moon, etc., etc. So it will become clear. Stay tuned, folks. Don't switch off just yet.
Yes.
It's going to be, we hope, really interesting.
We hope so, indeed. And so, like I was saying, when we're putting this podcast, this episode out to coincide with the new moon, which is also a supermoon, it's a particularly kind of auspicious time. One of the most common things that you see is that when the new moon reappears in the sky, when that little kind of sliver of a crescent reappears, that it's to be greeted, basically. This is one of the most common things that you see. And time and again, it must be the most common kind of greeting that you see in manuscripts and elsewhere, and in literary sources, is the little rhyme, "I see the moon and the moon sees me, God bless the moon and God bless me." Which
is lovely, because we've found this time and time again in the manuscripts and in the school's collection, and during the month when we've been reading various articles, we've seen it referenced. It's quite an old little prayer, and it's lovely to see that it's actually kind of survived in oral tradition, because we've got it in the school's collection, say 1937 and 39, and then we were chatting about it yesterday, and you remember it from when you were a kid.
Yeah, I still say it.
You're old, but you're not that old, Jonny.
No, I still say it. Which
is lovely, isn't it? You can see that link.
I have a reference now here. You'll hear kind of authoritative shuffling of papers as I try to find out where it is. But just to kind of mention that notion of greeting the moon, and saying this kind of prayer to it. Where are we now? I have a piece that describes it. So here's from the 1937, from the manuscripts from the school's collection from County Meath. This is a young girl, Teresa Morris, and she's writing down lore of the moon. And she says, "It is not lucky to see a new moon for the first time through glass," which we'll also look at. You're meant to see it out in the open air for the first time. If you turn money in your pocket when you see it, your purse will never be empty during the following month. And if the new moon has the old one in its arms, it's a sign of bad weather. And what that means is, if you see the new crescent of the moon just arrived in, but you can also make the dim outline of the whole moon.
I see.
It's the idea is that it's the new moon holding the old moon in its arms, which is a portent of doom, Claire.
Oh, so we don't want to be seeing it.
No, we don't want to see the new moon on the old moon's arms. So when a person sees the new moon for the first time, they make the sign of the cross and they say the following, and they will then have good luck. Which while the moon holds, and they say, "I see the new moon sees me, God bless the new moon and God bless me." That was from Teresa Morris, who was 13 years old, May 18th, 1938. And then, so that's 1938. And then we have William Camden and his text, Britannia, where he talks about the customs and manners of the Irishry. He says some hilarious things about them, but they warble with their nimble fingers, they warble on their lyres and harps, and that they're prone to eating shamroots. Shamrocks, yeah.
He wouldn't have been an ambassador for us, would he?
He would not. But he says, when talking about the moon, he says, "I cannot tell whether the wilder sort of Irishry," this is in 1586, by the way, "I cannot tell whether the wilder sort of Irishry yield divine honour unto the moon. For when they see her first after the change, Commonly they bow the knee and say over the Lord's Prayer, and so soon as they have made an end, they speak unto the moon with a loud voice in this manner, and they say, Leave us as whole and sound as thou hast found us. So it's a kind of common notion to greet the moon with prayer, but also with a certain amount of fear, trepidation, in a sense of like, please leave us as you have, don't.
And this is true across the world, because even in the readings we've been seeing Native American tribes, and we've been seeing in China, in Polynesia, the Hindu tradition.
Yeah. Which is, of course, so closely linked to Indo-European and European heritage. Absolutely. It's the same streak kind of coming through as well.
So us speaking about this, we could easily have colleagues sitting with us and nodding in agreement.
Yes.
Saying, we have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's part, as we'll come to see as well, and some of the figures and the habitations and their place in the moon. It's part of a broad kind of international context in the European tradition, in an Indo-European tradition. But again, it goes to show, which is something we were discussing yesterday, the little varying details from place to place. They show the living nature of folk tradition, how it kind of, an overall theme will be expressed over a large area, and yet it'll reflect the specific local environment very kind of particularly in a certain way. And
one point I was going to say at the very beginning, but I think I just find it interesting. I can't explain why it is as it is. They haven't given an explanation, but we did have a gentleman in our main manuscript collection from County Wexford who was saying that it was thought unlucky for women to talk about the moon. So I'm really taking my life in my hands.
You see, this is, indeed. This is one of the strange things as well. And one of the things actually that I did notice in kind of organising material for this is that you get a lot of references in the primary sources to the moon, but it's a lot of them often would just be little snatches like that. Kind of, and oftentimes it even shows a certain sense that some of these beliefs have maybe become so detached from any kind of, they're just being kind of replicated by customary example, and they're quite dramatic and simple to do, but it's not known anymore why this is the case. They're just kind of being repeated. Yet, however, with specific, say, taboos or prohibitions on certain genders in regards to certain work or whatever, this is quite a common thing in folk tradition. And another aspect we can look at the moon is the moon and its gender, how it's personified as male, where it's personified as female, or its influence over males, or its influence over females. And even the whole, again, we were mentioning the connection between menses, menstruation, month, moon, all means to measure, again, it's like the sense of time. And the connections with femininity and masculinity and so on, and the moon and the sun and all these sorts of things, in a kind of, in quite a deep sense, I suppose, they have these symbolic aspects to them, which in some instances, maybe these kind of things draw a connection to, or find expression as certain taboos. But then when you just read these kind of very brief satches of information in the manuscript,
without context, it's quite hard, isn't it?
It is to derive any, and you could look at things that are just similar, of course, and say, this is clearly kind of what was it, Valensi's kind of, it's a savour of paganism kind of coming out this, but actually it's much more complicated, I suppose, to know really.
And we're going to come to that idea of gender shortly when we talk about the man and the moon and the personification of the moon, as you said, because it's fascinating that it is a man in the moon, that it's not a woman in the moon. It's very rare that you would hear of a woman of the moon. So this idea of gender, if someone had told me, so Claire, when you're speaking about the moon, gender will form a large part of what you're speaking about. Isn't it? I would have been like, will it? It forms part of it.
And it was seen, I guess, to have a pronounced impact overall on human affairs, basically, and people would try and match the work that they would do to the phases of the moon in many ways. I'll play before we go on. This is a very brief piece from Doreen Collins in Bray, and it was in County Wicklow, and this was recorded in 1979. And she's just discussing. She very briefly mentions the fact of the new moon and it being unlucky to view through glass.
There are some beliefs about the new moon as well.
Well, when you see the new moon, you immediately turn whatever money you have in your pocket for luck, and if you see it through glass, it's very unlucky.
That's
the new moon, the first quarter. Like if you see it through glass.
That's if you've already been out though and have seen it, does it matter?
Oh no, it's if you see it for the first time.
you always have this idea of unlucky to see it through glass, through a window, over your left shoulder. It's so interesting how these ideas come up.
The other common one, if you see it over your left shoulder. But again, you know, there are quite old ideas about left and right, sunwise, anti-sunwise, clockwise, anti-clockwise, that which is sinister on the left, that which kind of goes against nature, as opposed to, like, you should never pass a drink anti-clockwise. It should always go sunwise around the table, because to do otherwise is kind of bad
Why would
luck.
you be passing drink away from yourself, Jonny?
Well, if you're passing it to one of your friends in a local imbibery or a bottle, as it were.
Okay.
Yes,
That
why
makes
would you
sense.
be passing your own drink around? That would just be perverse. If you're passing a bottle around, it should be passed sunwise. That's for listeners to avoid disaster.
Perfect.
And embarrassment, indeed.
Well, I know to do it counterclockwise. Oh,
Terrible, yeah.
Well, could you show your face again?
No, probably not. Not in any good standing or decency, at least. But many of those ideas relate to do, I suppose, to try and model your behaviour to reflect that which is occurring in nature. And so at a very basic level, that which follows the arc of the heavens, even, to go to the right with things.
And that ties in nicely with the what we're going to speak about now. Actually, might be a nice time to go with the planting, the weeding, the gelding, the castrating, working with livestock. Should we jump into that?
Let's. The idea, I suppose, that crops should be set at a certain time, a certain phase of the moon, and that the moon had an impact over not just human affairs, but those of an agricultural situation as well. So farmers would often sow their crops when the moon was past being full, and it was kind of starting to wane, basically. And I mean, often it was taken as very good luck to do anything, to have any new undertaking, to do so at the new moon, because by virtue of the moon's waxing and growing to its fullness, so symbolically or similarly would your new endeavour also grow to its fullness.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, if you were to say undertake a new beginning when the moon was at its height and a full moon, and now it's in a process of waning, then similarly all of your good efforts will come to nothing, because the earth and the world, the cosmos, is in a natural waning phase. So in a kind of magical way of magical thinking or symbolic kind of reasoning, when the moon is coming in, then it's a beneficial time for you to engage in new labours, because you'll receive the maximum reward. And yet when it's doing the opposite, you should not undertake those. I remember chatting to a Leitrim man, farmer here in the archive one afternoon, who said that he would only kill his livestock, and the older people in the area as well, they'd only bleed out their pigs on a new moon. And his idea was that if they did, that the meat would kind of fatten, basically, that they'd get more for their return. But if they did it at a full moon, they wouldn't. So it's this kind of strange idea that these processes are connected.
And it's funny because it crosses over into many other aspects. So you see ideas of cutting hair at the new moon means that it'll grow stronger. What else do they do? There is cutting of hair, the cutting of nails, cutting of corns, because you've got
cutting corns. Yes,
I know, lovely.
Yeah.
Because then there's a line someone says from Ulysses, even where James Joyce, who was a modernist and trying to move away from these ideas of the Yeatsian romantic folklore themes.
You are?
No, Ulysses.
Oh, he
James
was.
Joyce.
Yes, terrible thing to do.
No, we don't want to move away. Why would you? So in Ulysses, actually, he's so knowledgeable about this folk tradition, despite what he said. He speaks about a woman who was cutting her hair in the new moon. Even just to reference that in one of the great works of literature, his awareness of this,
the popular tradition.
That popular tradition of cutting hair in the new moon to make it stronger and more lustrous.
This woman and her inclinations, she's obviously high-born, because there's a quote here from Pliny, AD 77, so 2,000 years ago, basically. And he says, "The Emperor Tiberius used to observe the changes of the moon for cutting his hair," which is fair, I think.
Well, why?
Emperor Tiberius. So that's, again, you have like 2,000 years spanning between those two customs. And there's something to say that it's not kind of considerably older than that,
Absolutely.
as well. But yeah, crops as well were often sown at this period as well.
And should we say something about the Zodiac, which just very briefly for the sake of
please,
it
indeed.
was so interesting when I discovered this. So the more we were reading about the idea of working with the phases of the moon and being guided by those in your kind of daily activities on the land. Say, for example, we came across this idea of farmers having the almanac hanging at the back of the door, and the almanac showing the phases of the moon, which would guide them. But actually, interestingly enough, from the 15th century onwards, this little picture of a man started appearing in the almanacs as what they call the man of the Zodiac, or the man of the many signs. Now, we have one here in front of us just so that we know what we're speaking about, but if you Google the man of the Zodiac or the man of the signs, and indeed some of you might already be aware of him, you'll see a figure of a man, and then you'll have, corresponding to each part of his body, one of the 12 signs of the Zodiac. So, for example, you've got Aries is pointing towards the head. You've got Gemini, a kind of a set of twins, pointing towards the arms. You've got Leo with the lion at the heart, and then Pisces, the fish, at the legs. So you're moving through the body from head to toe through the Zodiac. And so you have these really interesting ideas of not only are they being guided by the phases of the moon, but you start seeing them with references to the Zodiac as well. So I'll read one as an example. This is from the journal Western Folklore, and you've got the line, where is it? Folk usage also combines the signs with the moon phases. So we have plant watermelons on a twin day in April on the last quarter of the moon. Or if butter beans are planted during the light of the moon and in the sign of the twins, you can pick them until frost. So it's basically this idea of planting them in the new moon when the new moon is in Gemini being the twins. So it's just this lovely idea. We just thought, for the sake of giving you a full picture of things to explore if you're interested in this, phases of the moon with regards to the Zodiac as well, it actually played a part in how people would have gone about their daily lives.
It's so interesting, and it's a thing that often, again, I remember when I first began to become obsessed basically by aspects of folk tradition, it's exactly these kinds of things. It's like the fact of suddenly having a certain sense of a kind of revelation, like, oh, actually I never knew, why are the days of the week called that? I never even thought about that. Like, why? That's bizarre. And then all of a sudden you look into it, and there is an enormous amount of material to try and kind of, like I said at the outset, there's kind of thousands of years of pagan and Christian tradition that can be plainly observed by reciting the days of the week in 3 languages or something like that, which is
it's building up
insane.
A jigsaw, isn't it?
It's crazy.
Yeah, we only have the pieces. We just don't see the big picture at
often,
all.
Yeah. I'll play another piece here from the Sound Archive. This was collected again in 1979 from Martin Junior Crean, and Junior Crean was a fantastic fiddle player. But Tom Munnelly, who's an amazing collector of English language song and full-time collector here for the folklore collection, did a lot of interviews with him. And this is where Junior describes the influence of the moon on crops.
But the moon, people used to watch the moon for sowing the seeds, and they wouldn't sow seeds until the last quarter of the moon. Cabbage seeds or corn, because they'd be up to start. You'd have a big stem coming up with no leaves. And they were very particular about the moon, or hatching eggs. If we wanted all cocks, you would hatch them in the strength of the moon. If we wanted hens, the last quarter, before the new moon had come a few days, that would own the clutch. But I remember 2 old men talking. One man was so attached in the house with the other man, and the poor man, he never went to school, he had no learning. So he took a smoke after finishing the day's work, and it was the month of September, and the same year was very fine, a lot of fine weather. So the man in the house came conveying him. When they came out, they looked over, and the moon was rising beyond Mount Callan, and it was as red as blood. Oh God, says he to the man of the house, Patsy, says he, we're going to get terrible drought. Look at the colour of the moon. Fair tight how we are, says the man of the house. Well, I was reading the paper the other day, says he, and you know the length, that moon is away from where we are now. I don't know, says the Thatcher. 19 million and a half a mile, says he. Wish God bless your cracked head, says the other man who ever walked there.
I love that.
It's good, isn't it?
The Irish humour can't beat it.
But yeah, that's Junior Crean in Bonneville, County Clare, describing the impact of the moon on the crops and on the hens as well. and will they be male, will they be female?
Indeed.
And the question of drought as well. The moon was often was taken. Well, we'll look at this when we look at habitation, but it was seen to not just impact the tides, but to kind of hold water or release it, or to take up water or to release it, so that it influenced rain and the crops as well. That it would somehow kind of impact on how much rainfall that we had. There's another piece here, since we're talking about the almanac, which I'll play briefly, which is also Junior Green, and this time he's talking about the November moon and how it's a little hard to make out in parts, but he's talking about the almanac and how the November moon would kind of presage or betoken a very long and harsh winter, basically. But he describes how the farmer would get up. If the almanac said there would be a new moon at 2:30 in the morning on Thursday, then that's when they'd get up out in the field and they'd sow their bits, so that it kind of corresponded exactly with it, basically. But this is, again, Junior Crean. This was recorded in 1982.
And the November moon. Well, the November moon leave the wind to be there for 3 months.
Well, there was a November moon.
The November moon should be born in November. Even if it was the last day of November, it was a November moon to go out in, say, around Christmas. And all people used to get up. They'd have Dalmanic, and they'd no moon 2 a.m. the 24th of November. They'd get up at 2 o'clock, they'd have the alarm set, and they'd go out to know where was the wind from. They had no John Dillon or anything to tell them the weather that time. And I remember it lifted a few times to the east, and when you get the weather from the east, you have frost and snow. And it was in 1917 it lifted, as we'd say, toward the Cashel, Doohan Cashel, southeastly. But it started to freeze and snow, and it held until the following March or April.
He actually, it's mad as well to think that he's describing in 1917, 100 years ago, this bad winter that he remembers as a child. But he goes on then to describe saving a curlew who was kind of dying in the ice and snow out in Clare, and bringing it to school with them and heating it up and kind of trying to warm it and bring it back to life, which he did. And I was getting all naively kind of set there, like, oh, what a beautiful little story. And then yeah, exactly, streaming down my face. And then he gives it to the teacher, and they cook it and eat it. And he's delighted. And then I was like, there you are, that's the way things actually are. He's like, I thought he was going to suggest when the teacher says, I think we'll use this for the kind of home economics kind of class, or equivalent thereof, to show, this is what you do. No, please, don't eat this little bird. Like, yeah, great. And then they eat it.
I thought there was going to be a beautiful moment.
That's what I thought, and it goes at the window, and everyone flies off. Yeah. Warm and fuzzy feelings everywhere. But instead, no, it was just a nice lunch, and fair play to it, I suppose. Well. But that's Junior Crean discussing the almanac as well.
And it might be worth saying, when you're talking about the influence of the moon on activity, and then on the tides, as we kind of touched on, but also on the human as the very nature of life, the bloodstream, because there's this idea of, as the moon influences the tides, it also influences the bloodstream, which is really interesting, because there's a piece I read it was about an American doctor who started noticing patterns in his patients when he conducted certain operations, that at certain times of the month people would heal more, more effectively, whereas other times they'd often hemorrhage and need to be operated on again. And so out of curiosity, he conducted a kind of an informal experiment, and all of a sudden he saw that, he did, I think, more than 1,000 cases, he says here, and sure enough, 82% of bleeding crises occurred between the moon's first and third quarters, so around that period of the new moon, which is fascinating. So now again, science will come in and say, let's readjust our thinking on that.
How dare you?
But isn't it just interesting to see that?
It's bizarre. And that's actually, it was regarded as a very dangerous time to be cut at. Yeah. And I'm just looking for a reference here. I can't put my hand on it, but I remember reading that exactly as it described, that it influenced not just the tides but also the blood, basically. And I suppose one of the other, it leads us to one of the other very, very common assumptions that you have, again, with this impact over the the human mind, that people go crazy at the time of the full moon. I was reading a newspaper article yesterday from some British newspaper describing, although I'd heard it before, of course, that more police officers are deployed in the streets of towns and cities in Britain and in New York. I heard the same thing on the night of a full moon, because there are more violent incidents.
In contemporary reports?
In contemporary reports,
really?
yeah. Because there are more incidents of violence. And of course then, everyone, knows the idea that the word lunatic could be directly related to the moon or whatever.
And moonstruck.
Moonstruck is a crazy. Yeah, children
yesterday.
become moonstruck and hysterical. You must never sleep with moonlight shining on your face, because it will send you crazy, or else it'll cause your face to break out in these kind of crazy distortions that will never be undone. Remember, like when you'd be told if you make a face and the wind changes?
Yes.
I remember trying that. I'd be terrified. Like, oh God, if the wind changes, you'd be stuck like that. There's a reference here as I'll have to. What's this guy? He's describing some of the impact of the moon on.
Oh yes,
people.
This is
his artist
proactive.
friend, somebody with exactly, a proactive approach, and people who are listening should perhaps take this. He describes a friend of his, and he says, I once knew an unfortunate fellow who regularly went to a mental home a few days before the moon was full, knowing from previous experience that he would not be responsible for his actions at that time. For the rest of the month he was quite normal, and a great artist, exhibiting at the Royal Academy. So this is some fellow who decided he'd take matters into his own hands and check himself in, because he was prone to going mad at the time of the full moon.
better be safe than sorry.
Better safe than sorry, and in good company.
But we were saying yesterday, a friend of mine who's a teacher, and although she doesn't mark it on the calendar, every now and again she will come home and I'll ask her, oh, how was work today? And the first 2 words out of her mouth will be full moon. And that's not, she's not basing that on any particular scientific or folklore knowledge, but she will say full moon.
Yeah.
High as kites, they were giddy all day. Isn't it interesting though that we still have those conceptions in our head?
It is, of course. It is. And indeed strange that then, the local constabulary are deployed in their droves to manhandle and berate the inebriated and demented populace. At this time.
Do you know what I'll read? Because I was speaking about The Tailor and Anstey.
Oh yes,
which is a wonderful book which I've just finished. And as a side note, folks, if you're looking for some reading material, please do go and find it. It's The Tailor and Anstey by Eric Cross. It's just a wonderful book. But in it, the tailor, who is one of the main protagonists with his wife Anastasia or Anstey O'Buhala, he's speaking about one of his very, very dear friends, Jerry Coakley, who sadly has passed away. But when he's describing him, he says the following: when he was young, he had slept out under a May moon, which is one of the most dangerous things any man can do. Any moon is bad, but the May moon is the worst of them all. It always affects a man's brain. It affected my saint in his speech. He would turn words backwards, calling a hotel Tehot. But isn't that interesting? And that's the 1940s when the tailor is speaking to Eric Cross, that idea of being outside in the rays moon, and the moon's rays, beg your pardon, is unlucky or dangerous.
It's dangerous. There's another one here I have from 1621, and it describes the same idea that sleeping in moonlight is dangerous. And it says, when thou goest to thy bed, draw close the curtains to shut out the moonlight, which is very offensive and hurtful to the brain, especially to those that sleep. Which is bizarre. It's the same kind of idea that it caused, it was dangerous, or that it caused madness. Another instance here from the year 1393, and it says, lunatic lollers and lepers about are more or less mad according to the moon's phases. And there's this idea basically that the stars, another quote, can influence the devils themselves. And certain men who are called lunatics are molested by devils more at one time than another, and the devils would rather molest them at all times unless they themselves were deeply affected by certain phases of the moon. So the idea that these kind of spirits are bound by the phases of the moon, but that particularly at the full moon or in moonlight in general, this will kind of send you crazy. So
it's lovely though, because I saw Othello recently, and one of the lines is, it is the very error of the moon, she comes more near the earth than she was wont, and maketh men mad. And so, again, time and again, whether it's in folklore or in literature, the moon is always with us.
Yes, and of course, even, for examples of Shakespeare's and quotes and things, that he'll be drawing on folk tradition, and these kind of old ideas will be absorbed basically into the literary tradition, from people like Shakespeare to Yeats to Joyce and so on and further. So be sure to have your children and yourself safely locked away out of the moon's dangerous reach.
Folklore is just, it puts me on edge more than anything.
So I'm
How are we
terrified.
still alive, Jonny?
Living in a state of absolute terror. I remember reading another instance about in the 19th century, these young girls who come upon their aunt and they're giving her a kind of merciless slagging because they find her pointing a little wisp of straw at a wart in her hand and then pointing it at the moon to try and get rid of the wart, and she was mumbling something to the straw. This idea of sympathetic magic, that you can kind of take one item and then transfer it to another, basically. But her poor nieces were giving her a particularly hard time about this, and the poor woman was caught pointing at the moon, which is also meant to be bad luck.
To point at the moon?
To point at the moon, apparently, is bad luck, yeah. Everything's bad luck, of course, but...
Crikey. Tread carefully, folks.
But yeah, crops, human affairs, waxing, waning. I guess the basic idea, in again, for just to clarify maybe for people, of sympathetic magic would be the notion that there's a kind of symbolic relation between events in the natural world and their impact on human affairs,
yes.
or luck in particular. And so if, you shouldn't get married, say, at a full moon because, the earth and everything around it is in a process of waning, of going out, of decreasing. But your store will increase and your good luck will increase if you engage in a particular endeavour at a point when the earth is in a natural process of filling up
and waxing,
as it were, and waxing, essentially, and that's the kind of this idea of sympathetic magic, largely, that these things are kind of connected in some way.
And I think it's probably, there is so much in that alone that it's worth people going and having a bit of a rummage.
Absolutely. In
the materials and kind of visiting us here in the archive.
Yes, indeed.
Because it's fascinating.
We could provide some links and things as well.
True.
Under this podcast and the SoundCloud.
And then you too can get lost down the rabbit hole.
Exactly. Yeah.
And should we move on to perhaps the next half of the podcast? Yeah. In terms of the moon as a place of habitation and who perhaps might live there.
Who lives there? Well, this is another particularly interesting idea. The idea is of that the moon is personified, but that it's similarly inhabited. And this is also a particularly ancient idea, and is expressed in the myths and folk traditions of a great many nations and races the world over. One of the instances that we generally see, or one of the kind of common aspects of folk tradition that we see about the moon, is that it's inhabited by somebody who was banished there for breaking a taboo, basically. And often what we find in folk tradition is the idea that it's an individual who profaned the Sabbath, basically. So someone who was out working and indulging or engaging in hardly indulging in labours, but engaging in certain labours on a Sunday and didn't go to Mass and so on. And so it was promptly sent to the moon to be visible for all as a bad example. There are early references in Numbers in the Old Testament to Moses coming upon a man who's out gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And it's thought that perhaps that early kind of reference then in later Christian tradition becomes melded in to aspects of folklore, where this kind of biblical scene becomes referenced as the now becomes the man in the moon, basically. And but there are earlier pre-Christian kind of examples of that, and also in Numbers he just gets stoned to death. He doesn't get sent to the moon as such. But this is a common idea that we see in folk tradition later, that somebody's on the moon, often for gathering sticks or stealing bushes, essentially.
Oh, and it's tying in with that idea, isn't it, of people making sense, because what they're trying to make sense of, isn't it, the markings on the moon. So you've got Galileo in 1608-09 for the first time really seeing these what we call the seas now, or the craters. And so even when we look at the moon, we see that we can imagine different things on it. But that's what they're doing. That's what all this stems from, this attempt to understand what it is that they're seeing and what these dark markings are. Yeah,
that was, and I suppose there's a kind of a symbolic, or maybe an older symbolic element as well that goes into some of these descriptions. But certainly the idea of when commonly when like as I was growing up, the man on the moon was just the general kind of face that a person can imagine to see. But commonly what was also imagined is that you see in the centre, in the heart of the moon, and we'll play a quote from it, is a man standing there, and on his back there's a big huge bundle of bushes, and he has a big stick with him. And this is the man who was banished there, basically.
For breaking the Sabbath.
For breaking the Sabbath, yeah. So you have this kind of biblical tradition. Then in Germanic tradition, in German folklore, this was absorbed. There was an old man who goes into the woods to gather sticks on a Sunday. He gathers up his bundle and slings it across his back and begins traipsing home. But he meets a man, basically, who chides him for working on the Sabbath and profaning the Sabbath, basically, and working on a Sunday, and declaring that all men must then rest from their labours. To which this guy replies, Sunday on earth or Monday in heaven, it's all the same to me. And this fellow is outraged by this, and he banishes them to stand for all eternity on the moon as a warning to Sabbath breakers, basically. Another instance from German folk tradition says that the moon is populated by a husband and wife, and the husband stands in the moon with a bunch of brambles and thorns that he strewed across the church path in order to hinder people from attending Mass on Sunday morning. And his wife stands there. She was duly banished because she made butter on this day. So she has her butter tub. But they both basically profane the Sabbath. And then there were North Frisian Germanic tribes. He told of a man on Christmas Eve who stole cabbages from his neighbour's garden. But he was spied by his neighbours as he was making off with his load, basically. And his neighbours, as punishment, they conjured him up to the moon, and he now stands there bearing these kind of stolen goods, basically. So the idea of the moon as a thief is particularly old, basically. But in Irish tradition, we have a similar kind of ideas, basically, that there was these same notions have made their way across again. You can see the international kind of context of this sort of these traditions, where in Irish tradition, in Irish kind of folklore, similarly, an individual is there for breaking a taboo. There's a piece here in our archive from the school's manuscript collection, and this is transcribed by a young fellow, Daniel Whelan, in County Carlow, who was in 6th class in the year 1937. Who was engaged in the school's folklore collection, the manuscripts that we have here. And so he describes this particular individual and local lore regarding the man in the moon, and he says, one Saturday evening, a woman told her husband to go to the forest to gather sticks, because the next day was Sunday and he could not gather them. The man went to the wood and fished the whole day, and in the evening late he came home without any sticks. His wife did not know because she was in bed. He got up early the next morning and went to gather sticks. When he had a good bundle, he put them on his back to start for home, when he heard a voice calling him to leave down the sticks or else to carry them forever. He said that he had to bring them home to his wife to cook the dinner. Then the voice said, carry them forever, and immediately himself and the sticks went up in the air until they reached the moon. When he was in the moon, the voice said, you will stay here forever because you worked on a Sunday.
That's typical. Just you ask a man to do one thing.
Look at... Yeah, it is. In fairness, he was and how he was fishing in a wood. Perhaps there was a pond or a lake in the wood, but he was fishing in the woods. I doubt he caught much. But he should. I blame his wife for some reason.
All right.
So he gets banished for the moon. And he stands there with his sticks.
And now that you see him for
and now you
eternity.
see it because you must not work on a Sunday. You cannot profane the Sabbath, basically.
And it's that idea of being visible to all.
Held up as a bad example.
As a moral,
yes,
isn't it? The moral
exactly, yeah.
element of the story.
This is then another piece from 1937, the school's collection in County Cork, and it describes the man on the moon being placed there as punishment again. It says, sometimes there can be seen in the moon the shadow of a man, and he having a bush on his shoulder. It is said that man stole a bush out of another's fence, and on account of that God would not allow him into heaven. So he sent him up in the moon, and he can be seen there still with his bush on his shoulder. This is a kind of common idea, basically, of the idea that the moon is a kind of liminal space between heaven and hell, a kind of purgatorial space, for want of a better word. I'll play a very brief piece, again from the audio archive here, that describes the man on the moon bearing this kind of load of bushes on his back, and that he comes down to take you away to kind of scare children. This is from County Offaly. This was collected from Willie Egan by the collector Jim Delaney in 1974, in which he describes the man on the moon.
But what do you used to say about the man on the moon then?
Well, then they tell you, a view out when the moon is shining real bright. Look up there, there's a man in the moon with a big fork of bushes coming down to hem you in a corner and hold you until he brings you up.
I see.
So, if you look up in the moon when it's real bright,
Yeah.
you'll see something nearly like that in the heart of it.
Yeah.
Well, they used to call that the man in the moon with a fork of bushes on his shoulder coming down to hem you in.
I see.
Right. Also, they used to terrify the children long.
There you are, duly terrified. So he's coming down with a big fork of bushes to hem you in and take you away, basically.
Keep the kids in line.
Keep the kids in line, yeah.
But it's worth saying as well that we have a questionnaire here in the archive from 1942, which is so interesting, because we were seeing just how they decided to send a questionnaire out in the man in the moon. But it's great that they did, because we have this knowledge now that they actually had the foresight to ask about something like this. But one of the things, just for to give you an idea, we have a few kind of subtypes, don't we, within this idea of the man in the moon. So just to kind of give you a very quick overview, We've got samples from, say, Munster. So it ties in with what you were saying, Jonny. A person stealing a bush or gathering sticks on a Sunday. This idea of punishment for stealing or punishment for breaking the Sabbath. Then we've got in, say, Mayo and Donegal in the north and northwest, and we'll come to this. It's a person fetching water and they're being punished for disobedience.
That's in Mayo as well.
It is. And they're sent to the moon. Then we've got in Galway, interestingly enough, we've got a person wishing to go to the moon. So they actually want proactively to go, and they ask God to send them. Then we've got one from West Mayo where someone actually curses the moon because they've tripped in the darkness.
Terrible.
And absolutely, why would you? And then as a punishment, they're sent. So we do see different kind of small subtypes and kind of redactions of this idea of being sent for punishment, but also you've got various being sent because you wish to go, being sent because someone else wishes you to go, being sent for punishment of theft or of disobedience. So it's so interesting within even just the island of Ireland, you've got this one overarching idea of person going to the moon, but all these different colours and shades as to how it's interpreted in different counties.
Yeah, it fits in with again the living nature of folk tradition, where you see, again, if we're to look at the broader European and even Indo-European inheritance or traditions regarding the moon, you'll see even the basic idea of its being inhabited, that then as this kind of stable or fundamental idea that then finds all these varying expressions in place to place because it reflects its local environment basically. But yeah, we have one of the main manuscript collections. Manuscripts is a questionnaire on the man and the moon, and also interestingly tied up in that again for the kind of vision of these of the collectors and so on. And the Folklore Commission, there's a questionnaire in the same manuscript on the names of the fingers of the hand and little traditional names and nicknames for them and things like this, which is on pictures of hands
How
drawn.
Would you even think?
Exactly, yeah. I've never heard anything of that at all. But the man in the moon is, in certain quarters, just known as the man in the moon, and then in other quarters is personified by a particular character who undergoes certain trials or is kidnapped or wishes to go, as you described there. In Kerry, there's Seaneen Sigali, and the people of Cork knew of Eamon Nigali, Eamon of the Moon, which is also, for anyone listening there, a term that was used to describe a useless man, which is a good one. And then in Donegal, Clare, in your neck of the woods, we hear tell of Donal Nigali.
That's true.
And he was a young fellow who was swept up to the moon for having refused to fetch a pail of water for his mother. I saw one instance where the young lad is in the narrative and his mother asks him to go and get a pail of water, and he's tired, he doesn't want to go out at night to do it. And then it says that this horrible woman comes in and she kind of demands that he go and get this water, and he goes out, and actually I remember in this narrative he in one of them wishes to be up on the moon. In another one he curses his mother or something like that, and the moon sweeps him up with his pail of water, and he tries to hold on to the bushes nearby, but they get swept up with him as well. So now you can see him up in the moon with his bushes and the pail of water. So you had this motif of the bushes kind of up there, or the gathering of there's all these kind of blending of different traditions basically. But the idea, I suppose, that it's personified by a certain individual, and again that they're kind of, the moon is like a thief or a kidnapper. But again, in the context of kind of research for doing this podcast, we found some particularly kind of interesting avenues and motifs that connect in. Again, it's hard to draw kind of clear lines of distinction with these things, or clear lines that connecting these two motifs, but the idea of the child who's swept away from the well and taken to the moon is a particularly interesting one that also features in Nordic mythology, and particularly in the Prose Edda attributed to Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic poet and historian from the 13th century. And in the Prose Edda, we read of the moon as personified as Mani, and he takes two children up from the earth, a sister and a brother, who are called Bill and Hjuki. And they were going to the well of Birgir, which means this well means hider of something in the Old Norse. And they're carrying, strewn across their shoulders, this pole called Simul, which means eternal. And then from this pole is held this water pail, Seg, meaning effervescent juice, apparently. So you have this figure of this young boy and girl with this kind of wooden pole strewn across their shoulders, and then the water pail between them. And then they were swept away from the well up to the moon, and then now follow Mani as may be seen from the earth. That's the quote from the Eddas. And they carry their water pail and their staff and their bucket. And so the idea then, I suppose, that you have this boy and girl who are taken up to the moon, and this motif of kind of water and even the connection of the moon and water is kind of interesting. But there's a strange kind of interesting kind of overlap into something that many people will know here that I thought was quite striking.
I feel there should be a drum roll here, Jonny.
There should, and it's very bizarre. Well, that the origin of the word has been derived from the verb yaka for yuki, and which means to heap or pile up, and Bill, the other character, from billa, meaning to break up or dissolve. So the name of the two character means one to heap or pile up, and one to break down or dissolve. These two figures then, the male and the female, represent or indicate the waxing and the waning of the moon, which again is kind of connected as a kind of male and female thing. But then strangely, these figures of Yaka and Bill are associated and have been connected with or viewed as Jack and Jill, who go in search of a pail of water. You know, Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water, and once Jill fell down and broke her crown, and Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after.
That's right.
And then something about brown paper. I forget the last lines of the rhyme. There was something about wrapping his head in brown paper.
Jeez, we did not have that.
This idea of kind of Yaka and Bill and their water pail and being swept up away to the moon is something that was attributed by certain scholars as being taken to kind of represent these spirits, but then becomes known as Jack and Jill, basically in kind of in the English language tradition. Either way, the idea of the kind of the moon being inhabited by male and female figures is one that's particularly interesting, and the idea then as well of pagan, I suppose, non-Christian approaches to the moon and its inhabitants that then have kind of Christian iconography and symbolism layered over them.
Yeah. And
it then becomes a figure who broke a Sabbath, later on. But the idea is much older than that and separate to just Christian tradition. But these two things meld. But it's interesting that figure with the water pail exists in Irish tradition, but only in the upper kind of northwestern portion of the country, which is might perhaps lend itself to some sort of a claim for kind of Nordic influence.
Well, that's
in that
it.
sense,
That's a very close geographic link, isn't it? It's fascinating. I hadn't realised until we started delving into it, really.
No, right.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. But I suppose overall it's this idea of kind of the close impact, not just in the measurement of time, but the meaning that then is associated to the passage of that time, and the meaning that's associated to the cycles, and what's the particular essence of those cycles, and what are the cycles within those cycles, and how do we kind of understand these things, and how do we act in best accordance with those cycles to bring about the best results, or be kind of in tune with the natural world, or with the universe at large, basically, to see that we're kind of not going against it or acting against it, in all of our affairs, basically.
And it's universal, isn't it? Which might be the nice way to end the podcast before we go to the treat from the archive. So to draw the podcast to a close, it might be nice to finish on this quote from Max Muller, who was an early philologist, and he, in speaking about early legends and all these ideas that we've been looking at today, he says, though they may be pronounced childish and tedious by some critics, seem to me to glitter with the brightest dew of nature's own poetry, and to contain those very touches that make us feel akin, not only with Homer or Shakespeare, but even with Laps and Finns. And what he's saying basically is, by looking at these, we start to see a broader picture of how we're all linked and united in our common fears, loves, hopes, dreams. Yeah,
it's part of this is our cultural inheritance. These are the threads that run through the tapestry of the whole, indeed. But we'll finish. This is a piece from the archive from a fantastic singer, Tom Lennon, from Milltown, Malbay, County Clare, and this is a type of song that was quite popular, mocking members of the opposite sex.
Oh, lovely. You didn't tell me about that, Jonny, before you chose it. You said it was a humorous...
It's a humorous...
That's all you said.
It's an entirely humorous song. But these are kind of common. For example, the idea of the young maid who marries the snivelling old man, or the young man who marries the old hag, basically. And this is a version of the latter. So, caveat emptor, buyer beware.
Lovely.
In this particular protagonist, he basically takes things too quickly, and he fails to correctly examine his partner, essentially, and he, having only observed her by the bright silvery light of the moon, which is the title of the song, he comes a cropper, as we shall see. And serves him right too. Well, yes, it does actually, yes. So I would suggest that you lock up your children, stay out of the moonlight, sow your crops, and stay safe. Stay safe, and essentially. The new moon is coming. Engage yourself in some sort of new endeavour. Yeah, and good luck with it. Indeed.
It was down in Killalay in the merry month of May, when the roses and the heather was in bloom. A fair lady passed me by, and she winked with her right eye by the bright silvery light of the moon. 'Twas a case of love at sight, but to us it was delight. We got cuddled up together very soon. We got married straight away in the church at Killalay by the bright silvery light of the moon. But she squandered all my dough, to our home we had to go. Oh, what a place to spend the honeymoon, with no fire in the grate, only looking at the plate by the bright silvery light of the moon. But when we went to bed, it is then I got in dread, for I knew that I was going far too soon. For 'twas there upon a chair I see her golden hair by the bright silvery light of the moon. But the worst was yet in store, for when she began to snore, she nearly pulled a blanket round the room. And 'twas there upon a peg I see her wooden leg by the bright silvery light of the moon. Now, young fellas, if you meet a fair lady down the street, try her well before you plan your honeymoon. Pull her leg and pull her hair, and make sure that she's all there by the bright silvery light of the moon.